All right, let's go.
Hi everybody, Julie's World Crochet back again with part 2 of our basic stitch techniques videos. This video is going to cover chain stitches and your foundation chain, as well as turning chains and those chains that we don't count as stitches when we're working our rows. Our first part 1 covered single crochets, half double crochet, and double crochet stitches. And I know it feels like I should have done foundation chain in the first one, but I wanted to be able to include that with the other discussions about chains. So to begin with, I'm going to be using just a worsted weight yarn. Of course, you can use any kind of yarn. And I'm going to use a 6mm crochet hook. It's a little bit on the large side, but it's going to be fine for this. To begin with, we'll take a look at how to do a slip knot. The easiest way, any kind of knot, as long as you start with a knot on the end so that you can work your chains. But generally, if you put the short end on top, you can just turn your loop over, and when you pull up this loop right through, you've made yourself a slip knot. Now typically, I do this when I'm already set up to begin, where I'll take my yarn, turn it over, and then grab a loop through there. So I begun with my slip knot. I can put that on my hook, and I'm good to begin. A chain stitch is simply yarning over and pulling that loop through the stitch on the end of whatever loop you have on the end of your hook. So all you're doing is yarning over and pulling through continuously will make you a chain. You can do anywhere from one chain, chain 1, chain 7, chain 5, whatever you want to do. Keep in mind that the thing about a chain stitch is that it is not worked into any other stitch. It's not attached to your work anywhere else. So a chain stitch is kind of free and lets you move your working space and your hook along without attaching to your fabric or your project that you're working on. So here, I'll do a couple more. Because we're going to talk about the foundation chain. So your foundation chain, of course, is the very beginning of your project, and everything's going to start with a chain. There is a technique to work and create not only your foundation chain, but your first row simultaneously, either single crochet, double crochet. I'm not going to cover that here. That's for another video. For this one, we're going to keep it simple because any chain will work. Just make your chain and you can always work from there. We'll take a quick look at the chain itself. Here's your stitches. Now on previous video, I had shown you, for instance, the top of my work where you can see each stitch in that lovely nice V. Here on your foundation chain, here's that same V's. Those are those same 2 loops we were talking about. If I come in here, those would be the 2 loops that you would see if this was the top of your work. However, you can also see, I'll turn this around, here is our 1 loop in the bottom, and that's because every stitch has 3 loops involved in making that stitch. Now you can have more and you can work in other ways, but you will always have the same 3 basic loops involved anyway. Typically, we would call this, if I was working this, your back loop, your front loop, and this is the back bump. I'll take that back out. So, and the reason I say that is sometimes this foundation chain can get kind of twisted, and it depends on your yarn. Some yarns can be a little more difficult to see. But you can see here, it kind of looks like the undulating coils of it, like a sea monster, where you can see those back bumps. That's what a lot of people work into when they're working their next row on their foundation chain. And the reason they do that is to preserve this set as a nice clean edge, right? So again, back with our little sample, this is the bottom. I had worked the back loops, those back bumps when I did my next row, this row of double crochets, which gives you a nice clean edge, but it's not necessary. And keep in mind, if you are going to be making a border onto this, if this is an edge that's going to be seamed, you're not even going to see it anyway. But it's not necessary. It's entirely up to you. I'm just in such a habit of it, I tend to do it all the time now, and I wanted to be able to explain that. So before I continue with the foundation chain and turning to your next row, I'm going to start with this swatch because, and I'm going to bring this back, because I want to be able to show you about turning chains and the initial chains that we use when we're starting a row, and explain how we use them and why they're there. So this is a row of double crochets. I'm just going to put my last double crochet into this row, pull through 2, pull through 2. I've completed that last stitch. Now we're going to need to turn our work, begin to work our next row of double crochets, in this case, in this pattern. If you notice, I did not put in a turning chain, because what I want you to see here, can you see how that pulls up like that? It misshapes this last stitch if I avoid a turning chain. The purpose of the turning chain is to give yourself enough yarn in order to be able to manipulate and move your fabric so that it'll sit nicely. Your stitch will sit well. You are never going to notice this turning chain as you continue to work. It's going to be absorbed into your fabric. That's why it's not a stitch. It's to allow your movement. Besides your stitches, which look pretty, and join them together, the purpose of your stitches is to fill in with yarn all of the spaces you need to fill in, and so that you can have your hook in a working position that's appropriate for the stitches you're performing. And I'll show you what I mean. There's my turning chain. So now I have my nice little stitch. You can see the post for my double crochet here, and then this is the first stitch that I would work into. When you're doing double crochets and when you see your pattern, you'll get that chain that you have to do at the beginning that doesn't count as a stitch, which kind of feels a little itchy in my brain, because why couldn't it be a double crochet? Or whatever stitch I'm performing. Keep in mind that your stitches are performed from the top down. So when you do a double crochet, it starts up here and it works down into your stitch below. And it may be less noticeable with something like a single crochet because it's such a shorter stitch. However, it still exists, and it's certainly more noticeable the taller your stitch is. That's why I'm using double crochets to kind of demonstrate the principle. So the point is that if you were to start with a double crochet here, it wouldn't be tall enough to start your work. And that's why you're using the chain stitches. Remember, it's the one way that you can move your hook and your working space to a position without having it attached to the rest of your row. That's why we're doing chain stitches there. That's entirely the purpose, is to bring you up to that working height. So I have a turning chain. Quite often, patterns will include this in the number of chains they are using to move their hook to their working position. That is perfectly fine. Again, remember, your turning chain plus your chains to move up are about including enough yarn in an attractive enough fashion so that you can be at the correct position. And I'm going to demonstrate that and you'll see exactly what I mean. So I'm just going to do 2 chains here. Between my turning chain plus my 2 chains, I am high enough up to do that work. So now when I come in for my double crochet, when I come down and do that, and in this case, you know, I'm going to work this into my first stitch. In this pattern, I would work my double crochet, pull my stitch, pull my loop, yarn over through 2, yarn over through 2. And in that pattern, they might say that this chain doesn't count as a stitch. Here's why. We had to put it in there to get our work up high enough. I've done 1 double crochet. Let me do 2 more. Right? Yarn over through 2, yarn over through 2, yarn over, pull a loop, yarn over through 2, yarn over through 2. So now I have 3 double crochets and a chain that doesn't count as a stitch. The decision on whether it counts as a stitch has to do with when we come back for our next pass on this on our next row. Let me turn this over. We're going to pretend I'm coming back. Pull this out. Here are my 3 stitches, 1, 2, 3, that I had just worked this way. So coming back, I will work stitch 1, stitch 2, and then this as my last stitch. This is not going to get worked. I'm not inserting, and I'm not doing another stitch into this stitch, into the chain space here. That is just being ignored. It sits nicely, it fills in my fabric. It's fine to have there, but I don't need it, and I'm not going to work a stitch into it which if I worked these 3 and then also worked into this space, I would have added a stitch to this row. And if you're not intending to do that, you don't want to do that. Similarly, if you work a stitch and it does count, especially if you're working in the round would be an example, and it does count as a stitch, in that case, it's because you will work it. And I'm going to go back here and I'll show you. If it's, say for instance, you're doing double crochets and your pattern tells you that this is going to count as a stitch, you'll notice that you're often told that you're going to work your next stitch here into your second stitch on the row below. And the reason you do that is because this here, that's going to count as a stitch now, here it is on top of that. It's using this space, it's using up this stitch. This is how you keep your stitch count consistent all the way through. So that, let me put one more in, so that when I come back, remember this one counted as a stitch, this chain. Here's stitch 2, stitch 3. So when I'm coming back, I would have worked, here's that one stitch, here's the second stitch, and I will work into either this chain space, depending on the pattern, or into this top of this chain, is what the instructions will say, the top of that chain as a stitch. And it's all about creating a fabric that is going to sit and lay and look the way you want. There isn't a right or wrong whether you're going to count this as a stitch or not. What counts, or what matters, is how it's going to look and fill in for you. So if this is going to work, then it's counted as a stitch, you're going to work it as a stitch. So that's how you make the distinction. Finally, on that, I'll just mention really quickly, here we have, I had shown you in the part 1 of the video, we had looked at the different stitches where the single crochet is the shortest, and then a half double crochet and a double crochet. So when I want to come into my new row and begin working, I'll pull this back, and I need to put in a chain so that I can bring my hook up to a working space. I'm going to, if I'm working single crochets, I might do 1 chain. 2 chains for a half double crochet, 3 chains for a double crochet. Because they are taller stitches, you need more yarn, you need to be working at this higher space. Let me show you what it looks like when we don't do that. All right, so here I've finished my last stitch. I'll even put in, yeah, I need a turning chain here. I'll even give it a turning chain. Now, so for a single crochet, like I said, we might put 1 in, whoops, one chain, chain 1 for the height of the single crochet. It doesn't count as a stitch, so I'm going to work from the very beginning stitch, single crochet, single crochet, single crochet. I want to show you, do you see how the height of this stitch is the same as all the way across? That's exactly what I mean by getting your fabric to look the way you need it to look. If I come back, let's say I'm doing double crochets. Instead of that, I will have, I resist completely, all things, turning chains, chain up so that I can move my working space. We're going to go right into the stitch I need. Let's do our double crochet. Insert my hook and pull a loop, yarn over through 2, yarn over through 2. It's kind of fighting me. The next stitch, yarn over, pull a loop, through 2 and through 2, yarn over, pull a loop, yarn over through 2, yarn over through 2. Okay, so here is what happens when I have failed to give myself that chain space to move up. This stitch, by the time I get to the 3rd, this is how tall it should be. This is what it should look like. But you can see the way it's kind of oomphed over and kind of stubby and wonky. And that's because there is no yarn for it to allow this to move. In fact, it's kind of got to pull and stretch in order to come up to the even height across my row. And when I come back and try and work this stitch, when I'm coming back on my return pass, again it's going to pull. Now imagine I do this all the way across every time I get to the end of a row. It's going to make my fabric sit and pull in awkward ways. It's not what I want. And that's why you need to, instead, I will put in my 3, 1, 2, 3 chains to get me to the height, the working height I need for my double crochets. Very often for a single crochet, when you do the one loop or the one chain to work a single crochet row, it'll say that it doesn't count as a stitch. But when you get to the double crochets, it will tell you that they do count, or pardon me, yeah, double crochet these chains, that they will count them as a double crochet. Again, there's not a right or wrong. Most often it's because this is a really, it's a bunch of yarn to get you to this space, and it looks and acts in your fabric just like an actual double crochet. So go ahead and count it. In this case, I'm going to count it. So I'll go into the next stitch, my second stitch for my double crochet. And one more time. Here we go. Just so you can see, this gives me enough now where my working space right on this edge is right at the top of my row. So this whole thing is going to sit really nicely and looks beautiful. It looks exactly the same. We're going to be great. So that is it for turning chains and why you have these stitches, your chain stitches at the beginning of the row. You need to get your hook and your yarn up to your working height. Whether or not you count it as a stitch has to do with when you come back on your next pass, making sure that you are not adding or decreasing the number of stitches by including this chain when you don't need to. And that'll be a decision often by patterns, but that's how you're going to make your decision. Just go ahead and keep that in mind. So when I come back to the foundation chain that we were working on, I'm going to point out that this is so low that we don't really need much of a turning chain because there's still quite a bit of movement. But what we do need to account for is, again, the coming up to the working height. I don't know how many this is. This is about 10, say 10 stitches here. So if I have 10 stitches and I'm coming back and I want to continue having 10 stitches, when I want to work, say, double crochets coming back, I need my 3 stitches, my 3 chains, to move my hook yarn up to this site. So let me mark. This is my last stitch. We're going to pretend that's number 10. That's where I want to work into. So let me put in, I want to do double crochets coming back, so I'll put 3, 1, 2, 3 chains. And here is that end stitch, and that is where I'm going to work my next double crochet. Let me pull that through. I'm going to take this off so it's not in my way, like so. I've put it into the correct stitch. I'm going to do 2 double crochets just so you can see. Here's how I would pull up this back bump. Just push through there to pick that up. And if you do that consistently, if that's what you want to do, it works out really nicely to be able to see as you continue to work it along. Here you can see there's the 2, and it's going to look a little bit curvy because it's just a chain so far, but you can see that in fact it gives you that nice square that tells you that you are you've put in enough yarn and you have the necessary chains so that as you work the rest of the fabric, it's going to sit really nicely. That's what that chain is for, and that's why it's included. Depends on what kind of stitch you're going to come back with, how high you need to get your yarn and your hook to your working height. Now I just want to show you, I talked about back bumps, but you don't need to do that. You can work anywhere in this stitch. Go ahead and just insert your hook and work your stitch. It is not necessary, although people do it, it isn't necessary and required. You can just push your hook in to pull your loop and then finish your stitch, right? It doesn't have any other effect except having a slight difference in how the bottom of that'll look. But if it doesn't bother you, it doesn't bother anyone else, it's entirely fine what you choose to do. That is the end of this little section on loops and chain stitches, and especially those chains that we don't count as stitches. I hope this really helps. The idea is that you have all the tools so that you can design your own projects. If you like what you're seeing, if this has helped you, please give it a like, give it a subscribe, and we're going to come back with some more content with other ways and other tools and techniques for designing your projects and making exactly the project that you want and you're going to be happy with. Can't wait to see you soon. Bye.